Hello, welcome to the Risk on Investor. My name is Chaz. In this video, we're going to look at what is Bitcoin, a bit about the history of Bitcoin, and why some people assign it value. So let's start with the big question. What actually is Bitcoin? Now, it might be something that you've heard friends talking about, you might have heard it on the news, but you might not really know what it is. Bitcoin is simply a way to transfer value from one party to another party without a trusted intermediary. What does that mean in practice? Well, let's imagine you pull out your phone now and you go on your banking app. Is that money really yours? Do you control that money? When you spend money from that account, who records the transaction? In all these cases, it's the bank. The bank could freeze your account at any point or remove money from your account. And the bank controls a central ledger where it records all the transactions for you. Bitcoin is an alternative where in this instance you wouldn't trust the bank's central ledger, you would trust a public ledger that anyone can verify. That stops discrepancies and mistakes happening and makes Bitcoin more secure. The only other form of trustless transfer of value that we have is a cash face-to-face transfer. That would be when you take some banknotes and you pay for some goods or services and give the cash physically to someone else in front of you. In that instance, the only difference between cash and Bitcoin is that Bitcoin can be transferred to someone without needing to be face-to-face to them. So how did Bitcoin come about? In October 2008, a white paper was prepared by an anonymous individual or group of individuals known as Satoshi Nakamoto. This white paper outlined what Bitcoin was and broadly how it works in high-level terms, and that was circulated to a newsletter of cryptographic enthusiasts. On the 3rd of January 2009, the open source code for Bitcoin was released, and the first block was mined by Satoshi Nakamoto. Embedded within that block was a message, and the message pointed to a news article from a UK newspaper known as The Times, in which it stated that the Chancellor was on the brink of a second bailout for banks. This gives us some clues as to the thought process behind the creation of Bitcoin. The brilliance of Bitcoin was that it had one central ledger that was maintained over the internet in a peer-to-peer fashion between all parties controlling the ledger, rather than relying on central institutions such as banks to maintain their own ledgers. In the current traditional financial world, every bank maintains its own ledger and those ledgers interact with each other. In the Bitcoin version, the Bitcoin ledger is one single ledger that's public, anyone can read it and anyone can host it. But what does that actually mean? What is that ledger and how does it work? The Bitcoin ledger works on a piece of technology known as blockchain. It may be something you've heard of before, and I won't go into the technical details, but we'll have a quick discussion about the high-level benefits and what it is. To understand a blockchain, you need to understand what a block is on a blockchain. And in Bitcoin's instance, a block is simply a unit of data which records transactions between different wallet addresses on the Bitcoin network. So that could be a transaction saying person A transfers 1 Bitcoin to person B. And so that block will contain a selection of transactions, but also a pointer back to the previous block in the chain. And that's where blockchain comes from, because every block points to the block prior to it in the network. So if you looked at any block in the blockchain, you would always know the series of transactions and you'd be able to find the block before it. That way, all the transactions are in a logical order and you can follow the ledger all the way back to the Genesis block that Satoshi mined in 2009. So why can't you just have the Bitcoin network without Bitcoin itself? Why do we need Bitcoin when we've got the blockchain technology? Why can't that just be implemented into everything that we need? The answer is surprisingly simple and twofold in my opinion. The first reason is that Bitcoin acts as a unit of account for the ledger. The Bitcoin ledger itself has no understanding of the wider world around it. A block only can hold data about transactions, and so that means it needs a unit of account for those transactions. So why wasn't the unit of account chosen to be the US dollar, or the Great British Pound, or gold? Well, it's simply because the Bitcoin network can't interact with the outside world. It can only deal with things within the code of Bitcoin itself. And so therefore, by having Bitcoin, you have something to record those transactions in. You can say that person A transferred 1 Bitcoin to person B, and that Bitcoin can have some kind of value associated with it, but the network doesn't need to know the value of Bitcoin to show that that transaction has taken place. Whereas if the Bitcoin network was going to be saying person A transferred 1 kilogram of gold to person B, the Bitcoin ledger needs some way of knowing that that transaction actually happened, which is not controlled by the ledger, and therefore the ledger would be open to discrepancies and errors. By using Bitcoin, the network controls the movement of Bitcoin, and it's recorded on the ledger, so you know whatever is on the ledger is what has actually happened. The second reason why we need Bitcoin, as well as the blockchain technology underneath, is because Bitcoin acts as a store of value. So where we've discussed that Bitcoin can be used as the unit of account on the network, that Bitcoin needs to have some kind of value to allow a transfer of value to take place when it's used as the unit of account. But how does Bitcoin then get value? Because it's just something controlled by the Bitcoin network. Why has it come to be worth the thousands of pounds that it is today? And that's simply tied to the value proposition of the Bitcoin network. As we discussed earlier, the value of the Bitcoin network is being able to transfer value from one person to another without an intermediary. That way you're not relying on any middleman, which could pose a risk to your transaction. So that in itself is the value that Bitcoin creates. So if you wanted to create a value transaction, but you didn't want to rely on a middleman, you might use Bitcoin. And if you want to use Bitcoin, then you need some value assigned to the Bitcoin. Now over time, as more people use the Bitcoin network and more people want to transact in Bitcoin, it means more people have to purchase Bitcoin. And as people purchase Bitcoin and record transactions in Bitcoin, the ledger itself needs to be maintained. And that comes on to another use for Bitcoin. So whereas a central financial institution's ledger, for example your bank's ledger, is maintained by its computer servers, there will only be a few points of critical failure for those servers. Maybe a power outage happens at a data center where that ledger is stored, or there's another problem with the bank's database. That can cause a problem with the actual ledger itself. So Bitcoin's network aims to mitigate that by having what's known as a decentralized network. That means the network is run by lots of individual nodes. You yourself could spin up a node for the Bitcoin network if you wanted and host the entire ledger on your home PC. All the nodes then talk to each other and make sure they've got the same ledger, and that keeps the network running and consistent across everywhere. But it does mean that if you were running a node on your computer, and for whatever reason your computer was off, or you lost internet connection, all the other nodes are still running the network, and when you came back online, your node would simply be updated to the latest version of the blockchain. That means the blockchain is very resilient and virtually impossible to hack, but the network therefore needs to incentivize as many people as possible to help run the network, because the more people that are running the network, the more secure it is. So what Satoshi Nakamoto did was encoded within the Bitcoin ledger itself that every time a new block is generated, new Bitcoins are generated as well, and those are provided to the person who added the block to the blockchain as a reward for helping the network run. I'm not going to go into that process now, but that's known as mining. But what you do need to know about mining is that it's very computationally expensive. That means it uses a lot of computing power to make the network run. There is a measure for how much computing power these miners provide to the network. At the time of recording, that's around 460 exahashes. Now, without getting into the technicalities, think of an exahash as just doing a computational exercise. So if I did 1 + 1 = 2, that would be a computational exercise. I'm adding two numbers together to get a result. So 460 exahashes means that the Bitcoin network is processing 460 quintillion computations per second, and this number has only grown with time. The benefit of this is that the more exahashes that the network has, the more secure it is, because if you wanted to brute force take over the network, you need to control more than 50% of the network's processing power. And so the larger the processing power, the more difficult that becomes. But 460 quintillion hashes is a big number, and so what does that actually mean in reality? If you were to use some of the newer graphics cards on the market, they would have approximately 1 megahash, or 1 million computations per second if they were processing the Bitcoin network. That means the Bitcoin network probably has the same amount of computational power as your home computer times by 460 trillion with a T. The Bitcoin network doesn't actually use graphics cards as computational power. It uses dedicated equipment that's specifically designed for the processes in the Bitcoin network. but that just gives you a flavour of how large the computational resource of the Bitcoin network is and how difficult it would be to get to over 50% of the computational power of the network. That makes the blockchain incredibly secure, and Bitcoin is what runs it. Now, as we said earlier, every time a block is produced, Bitcoins are produced, and those go to the miners, giving the computational power. Now, a block is produced every 10 minutes approximately, so that bundles up some transactions and gets appended to the blockchain. But every 210,000 blocks, which is about every 4 years, the number of Bitcoins released per block halves. So when Bitcoin was first created, the first block of Bitcoin actually had a reward of 50 Bitcoins, and over time that's slowly decreasing. And that puts a hard cap on the number of Bitcoin that will ever exist. That number is around 21 million. That's different to the currency and stores of value that we tend to use today. For example, in a currency in your local country, the government can produce more by issuing new debt. Banks in your local country can produce more by issuing new debt. Or if we look at store of values such as gold, we can go and mine more gold to have more gold in circulation. Around the year 2140, we will approximately reach that 21 million cap in Bitcoin, and no new Bitcoin will be created by the network. Therefore, the incentive to run the network will move from being primarily about the Bitcoin that's given by the network when it's freshly minted, to being more about transaction fees that people pay to use the network. Currently, transaction fees make up a small proportion of the network traffic. But as the price of Bitcoin goes up, and if people continue to adopt Bitcoin as a store of value, not necessarily as a currency, but as a store of value, then the transaction fees will rise on the network, giving long-term sustainability to the network. Now, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate a like down below. That helps small creators like me reach a bigger audience, and gives me encouragement and tells me that you're enjoying the videos. Bitcoin's initial proposal was as a way of peer-to-peer transactions. So think of giving cash to someone in the example we used earlier. The idea was that Bitcoin would replace that process. Now, I actually think that Bitcoin has failed at that. It's too expensive and too slow to use Bitcoin for small transactions. Instead, I think Bitcoin can be thought of better as a digital gold, as a store of value that's based in the digital world rather than the physical world. That's primarily because there's the hard cap on the number of Bitcoins that will ever be in circulation, but also because the network itself behind Bitcoin is much more resilient than the network that your local bank will run. There are a couple of other benefits as well to Bitcoin. For example, here in the UK we have different coins, and the smallest denomination of that coin is a single penny, whereas one Bitcoin can be denominated into much smaller units of account. The smallest unit of account is known as 1 Satoshi, named after Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin. That's a 1 times 10 to the negative 8 of 1 Bitcoin, or 0.000000001 Bitcoin. Bitcoin also can't be counterfeited, so whereas cash in society today, you can have fake coins and fake notes enter circulation, Bitcoin can't be counterfeited because it can only be created by the Bitcoin network, and every Bitcoin can be accounted for on the Bitcoin ledger. So if you tried to introduce new Bitcoin, you just physically wouldn't be able to do it. Another benefit of Bitcoin is that whilst Bitcoin is the unit of account on the Bitcoin ledger, there's nothing to say that it couldn't be the unit of account in the real world as well. So where we have different currencies currently, whether that be pounds or dollars or euros, if the underlying unit of account was simply Bitcoin, it would mean that if I went on holiday, as long as the place that I went accepted Bitcoin, I wouldn't have to pay the conversion fees to have my pounds converted to, say, euros or dollars to spend in Europe or the US. And finally, because Bitcoin is all in the digital world, it can be transferred across borders almost instantaneously compared with traditional finance systems. That means Bitcoin's seen big adoption early on in remittances, where people are sending money, for example, back to family members who may live in a different country, because it's cheaper and quicker to use Bitcoin than traditional financial applications. So where do I see Bitcoin going in the future? So long as people continue to use the Bitcoin network, and that could be because they don't trust intermediaries or because they want to do peer-to-peer style stores of value transfer, I only see a positive future for Bitcoin. The more people that adopt Bitcoin, the more demand there will be for the Bitcoin network, and therefore the more demand there will be for Bitcoin itself. That's likely to continue pushing the value of Bitcoin up, and we've seen it over the last 15 years go from worth virtually nothing to tens of thousands of pounds. And there's no reason why that can't continue. I've actually done a full video on this already, which you can see here, where it presents different price models going out to the future and provides access to a free tool where you can calculate the amount of Bitcoin you'd need to retire on. Hopefully this video was helpful for you today. Thanks very much for watching. See you soon.